Ranch San Pedro, locals.
Cop, fool! RT Locals gang!
Welcome to Boyz in the Hood TV. Today we tapping in the streets of San Pedro, and we're gonna be talking about the Rancho San Pedro Locos versus the Dodge City Crips, the Wilmas, and many other rival hoods that Rancho San Pedro had beef with. The Rancho San Pedro Locos are a long-established Mexican-American street gang based in San Pedro neighborhood of Los Angeles. The gang formed in the 70s in the Rancho San Pedro public housing projects near LA Harbor. Over the next few decades, Rancho San Pedro grew into the largest and oldest gang in San Pedro with an estimated number of 600 documented gang members at its peak. Like many Southern California Latino gangs, they were also under the Rancho umbrella, having ties to the Mexican mafia. By the 80s, San Pedro was riddled with crime. In the first 3 months alone, the harbor area saw over 16 homicides and gang-related incidents. Now, also in the early 80s, Rancho San Pedro was at war with the Harbor City Boyz, a Mexican-American gang which was founded around the Harbor Village projects. On November 16, 1980, a man by the name of Mario Bueno of Harbor City Boyz will be gunned down by 2 Rancho San Pedro members. Not long after, the San Pedro members will be arrested for this murder. But only 4 days later, the Harbor City Boyz will be looking for some payback. And on November 24, 1980, Rancho San Pedro members Johnny, Robert, and Verdine were driving down 3rd Street, getting ready to turn on Mailer Street, when a dark Cadillac full of Harbor City Boyz would open fire, hitting the truck multiple times. This would lead to a high-speed chase as the Harbor City gunmen will continue to open fire on the truck. Eventually, the Rancho San Pedro members would turn down the 200 block of North Gaffey Street. The Harbor City Boyz would abandon the chase, would eventually be pulled over by a patrol car, where the driver of the Cadillac, Ruiz, would be arrested after the police found a spent shell casing inside the car. Somehow, the Rancho Pedro members were not hurt in this shooting. Just 45 minutes later, another shooting would take place, and the Harbor City Boyz would be right back at it again. But this time, the shooting wouldn't involve the Rancho San Pedro members, but it would involve their next-door neighbors, the Dodge City Crips, who they shared the project complex with, which also makes them an automatic enemy of the Harbor City Boyz. So Harbor City would take aim at 2 Dodge City Crips who are also getting ready to turn down Mailer Street, and the Harbor City Boyz will open fire on the vehicle. The Dodge City Crips, just like the Rancho Pedro members, will survive the Harbor City Boyz attack. Now this just goes to show you how active the war was going on in the early 80s. The Rancho San Pedro members were extremely active in the early 80s, including members as young as the age of 13 years old. On Thursday, January 1st, 1981, Rancho San Pedro gang was having a New Year's Eve party near 137 North and Marshall Court, when the next-door neighbor, 72-year-old George Morrell, complained about the gang's loud music. George Morrell will walk over to the Rancho San Pedro's house and turn down their music himself, and that will be a big mistake. As George Morrell walked back to his house and stood on his porch, 13-year-old Rancho San Pedro member, who had been drinking all day, pulled out a .22 rifle and would open fire. He would shoot Morrell 7 times in his chest, and Morrell would die just 30 minutes later. The 13-year-old Rancho member will be arrested for this murder and convicted. While entrenched in warfare, some members were out just committing havoc in the streets against anyone, not necessarily gang members. But also in the late 80s, there was a San Pedro local member who had a dark obsession with the recently released film Nightmare on Elm Street. 18-year-old Angelo Rosino, who also suffered from cystic acne scars on his face, and he also owned a brown fedora hat, similar to Freddy Krueger. Angelo, who had a minor criminal history, he also suffered from a bad drug habit at the time, and he was attending the Williamson Drug Counseling Program. On January 7, 1988, on West 18th Street, Angelo approached a pickup truck armed with a rifle and wearing a brown fedora hat with a bandana wrapped around his face. Inside the truck was 49-year-old Johnny Healy, who was sleeping. Healy was sleeping in his vehicle that night after he had an argument with a roommate. As Angelo approached the vehicle, he attempted to rob Healy, but he ended up shooting Healy multiple times at close range, killing Healy right there inside the truck. A witness in a nearby apartment building saw Angelo wearing his dark windbreaker jacket and wearing a fedora hat as he lurked around Healy's truck at the time of the murder. Not long after, a passing-by vehicle noticed the lifeless body of Johnny Healy. Just a few hours later, and a couple blocks away, Jerry Brookham, who was 37 years old, would be approached by Angelo. Brookham was leaving a bar on Pacific Avenue, walking by himself, as Angelo hopped out of the dark, once again wearing his brown fedora, armed with his .22 rifle. Angelo then demanded that Brookham give up his money, but Brookham decided to take off running, and he ran behind the bar, somehow escaping Angelo. After 2 failed attempts, Angelo would go quiet, but weeks later, on February 19, 1988, 24-year-old Cruz was walking home alone on 17th Street in Mesa, not far from Angelo's home, when suddenly Angelo spotted him and jumped from behind a wedge with his .22 rifle in hand. Once again wearing a bandana over his face and wearing his brown fedora hat, Angelo would force Cruz to lie down on the ground as he goes through his pockets. But then Angelo would order Cruz to march down the street into a back alley off West 17th. As Cruz is walking, Angelo forces him to walk left, then right, then left again, almost as if he was playing with him. Then finally, Angelo told Cruz to strip off all his clothes. And after Cruz removed his clothes and pants, he stood in the alleyway completely naked. Angelo would then approach Cruz and say to him, "Do you know who I am?" Krueger, Freddy Krueger. Angelo then demanded Cruz to turn around and start running. As Cruz started to run, Angelo would open fire, but luckily, Angelo would miss every single shot and Cruz was able to escape. But less than 24 hours later, Angelo was back at it again, but this time with a fellow Pedro gang member. On February 20th, 1988, Angelo and Thomas Grajeda would hit the Ego Convenience Market store, a small neighborhood grocery store in San Pedro. Still wearing his brown fedora hat, Angelo and Thomas, both wearing blue bandanas over their faces, kicked in the front door of the store. Both armed with rifles, Angelo and Thomas demanded the store owner, Grace Kim, to hand over all her money. Grace would go through the register and get all of the money total from that day, which was a total of $6,100, and she handed it over to Angelo. Before leaving, Angelo would fire a warning shot into the ceiling. Luckily, nobody was hurt in this incident as Angelo and Thomas fled. By late February 1988, a task force at the LAPD Harbor Division were already active looking for Angelo. Based off the description from the victims and the surrounding area where the crimes were committed, evidence would lead the officers to Rancho San Pedro Hood, an apartment complex on West 17th Street. While canvassing the area, one woman named Gloria Salcido would state that she had seen a young man wearing a brown fedora hat, and that young man happened to be her son, Angelo. Officers then would obtain a search warrant and search Angelo's home. And inside his bedroom, they would discover a brown fedora hat, a windbreaker, and a .22 caliber rifle used in the crime spree. Not long after, they would get word where Angelo was at. They would arrest Angelo at the Drug Rehabilitation Center in Wilmington. Also, Thomas Grajeda would be arrested also. During questioning, Angelo would deny having any involvement with any of the crime sprees that took place and would deny that the gun was his, but that he was keeping it for a friend. But at trial, Thomas would plead guilty to the store robbery and he would be sentenced to 4 years at California Youth Authority facility. On April 12, 1989, Angelo, who is now 20 years old, will be found guilty and he will be sentenced to life without parole. Now, there's plenty of reports about the history between the Rancho San Pedro and the Dodge City Crips, who lived in peace all the way up into the 90s because they both shared the same housing projects. But there were also violent incidents that took place in the late 80s between the groups. On April 26, 1986, both Rancho San Pedro members and Dodge City Crip clique called the 2nd Street Mob will be at Peck Park. Also in attendance was Florencia 13, Marco Guzman, and Cesar Soto, who are acquainted with the Rancho San Pedro members. A fight would eventually break out between Rancho and the Dodge City Crips, and a gun was drawn, and the female from the Rancho San Pedros will be shot, and this would piss off members of Florencia 13. Later that evening at around 7 p.m. at the San Pedro housing projects, Timothy Chavez, Derek McCant, and Louis Riley all stood outside talking. According to authorities, the 3 men were not gang members, but they did live in the projects. Moments later, 2 members from Florencia 13, Marco Guzman and Cesar Soto, would ride by and open fire, and all 3 men will be shot. Timothy Chavez, Derek McCant will be fatally wounded and will die from their injuries. Louis would survive. Both Florencia 13 members would flee the scene, but not long after, Cesar Soto and Guzman will be arrested for the murders. Prosecutors believe that Florencia 13 members retaliated on the behalf of the Rancho San Pedro members for the shooting that took place at the park earlier in the day. Just 2 years later, in 1988, it will be a very active year in the Harbor region. We will see Rancho San Pedro locals have a run-in with the Carson City gang. On March 29th, 1988, Westside Piru members will be at Peck Park. Also in attendance was Rancho San Pedro locals. In the early part of the day, everybody was getting along, but around 9:30, a fight would break out between Piru members and the San Pedro locals. Words were exchanged, and somebody from the Rancho locals would open fire at the Piru members, killing 23-year-old Robert DeVoe. Piru members would return fire, but the San Pedro gang members would flee the scene. Robert DeVoe is the brother of a well-known member, Danny DeVoe, of the Booyah Tribe, a rap group from Carson. On August 14, 1988, two members of Vadio Wilmas will be riding through Rancho San Pedro housing projects and open fire on an apartment building where people were standing outside. Sadly, a 14-year-old named Michael Fox will be hit in the chest as he rode his bike. His family would run to his side as he told them he would be okay, but sadly, he would eventually die from his wounds. Fox was not a gang member, but his family did stay in the housing projects. This was just a prime example of the dangers of both Rancho San Pedro Locos members and Dodge City living in the same exact project building. These shots clearly were meant for both gangs because the Vadio Wilmas hated both the Dodge City Crips and the San Pedro Locos. By the 90s, Rancho San Pedro was in beef on all sides, but there would be a peace treaty amongst the gangs in the city around 1992. For a few years, there was peace amongst the rival gangs. They all agreed to no guns and no violence when it comes to any disagreements. But that treaty would soon be shattered when a newer up-and-coming hood by the name of Young Crowd, aka San Pedro Young Crowd 13, decided to ignore the treaty. As it was said by authorities, Young Crowd from that area had deep ties to Linwood, so their loyalties were being stretched. And there were tit-for-tat shootings with Young Crowd and the Rancho San Pedro members. On February 6, 1996, two Rancho San Pedro local members, Jose Rodriguez and another 17-year-old, were spotted individuals who they believe were members of Young Crowd 13 sitting in the car on the 200 block of 13th Street. 12-year-old Lydia Jaquez and her brother Joseph and cousin had just left the party and were sitting in that vehicle. San Pedro member Rodriguez would roll down his window and open fire. The car would attempt to flee, but the Rancho San Pedro members would chase them down as Rodriguez continued to shoot at the car. Eventually, the car would pull into a driveway on Beacon Street and everybody would jump out of the car. Rodriguez of San Pedro Locos would continue to open fire, shooting 12-year-old Lydia in the top of her head as she tried to duck. The San Pedro Locos would flee the scene and Lydia would be critically wounded and she would be transferred to UCLA Hospital where she eventually would die. Both Rodriguez and the 17-year-old Rancho San Pedro members will be arrested and be sentenced for this murder and multiple attempted murders. Just 3 years later, the war with the Wilmas and San Pedro will be evident. On July 3rd, 1999, Rancho San Pedro members, including Walter Rodriguez, were standing outside of a club when they see a couple of females walk outside. They try to flirt with the women, which included Maria and Elena, who are with a group of other guys, but the females ignored them. The women would walk to their cars. Rodriguez and the Rancho San Pedro members would approach them. When the San Pedro members noticed the men that were with them, they suddenly started attacking them. George and Jose were being stumped out by up to 15 Rancho San Pedro members. The other men that were with George and Jose, named Alejandro, who was Jose's brother, and also a known Eastside Wilmas gang member, would hop out the car and start fighting with the Rancho Locos, when suddenly Rodriguez of Rancho San Pedro would pull out a 5-inch blade and start stabbing Alejandro. Not only will he stab Alejandro, he would stab Jose and everybody in the group with Jose. Eventually, the Rancho San Pedro members will all flee and Alejandro would die from his injuries. Not long after, Walter Rodriguez will be identified and he will be arrested and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Alejandro and the attempted murder of the 3 other men. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Rancho San Pedro members shared their home turf with the Dodge City Crips, which, if you didn't know, is a predominantly African-American Crip gang who for years, they did have their issues, but it never truly boiled over to a full-blown out war. But that would all change in the mid-90s. In 1996, an argument would break out between the Dodge City Crip and a San Pedro member, and the Crip would be gunned down. This death would spark a vicious war, which included racial tensions that would split the housing projects in half. There would be continued shootouts all throughout the 90s, and this war would eventually spill into the 2000s. On February 2nd, 2000, Dodge City Crip member Perry Lee Clark, aka Taz Loke, will be standing outside of 380 West Santa Cruz Street, where he will be shot and killed, allegedly by Mousy of Rancho San Pedro. Mousy would later be arrested for his murder. Then in 2004, allegedly Rancho San Pedro member known as Spanky will kill his own cousin of the Dodge City Crips, known as Kiko Loke. But about a year later, on January 2005, Rancho San Pedro members Hector Garcia, Andy, and other members attended a party thrown by Michael and Oscar Gutierrez, 2 brothers. While there, a friend of Michael's named Terry Bullock showed off his tattoo of deceased friend Kiko Loke, who, as we mentioned, was a Dodge City Crip who had died last year. Rancho San Pedro member Hector Garcia would overhear Bullock showing off his tattoo and talk about Kiko Loc. Garcia would then approach Bullock and start banging on him and letting him know that he was from Rancho San Pedro, but Bullock would immediately respond that he didn't gangbang. Later on, another Rancho San Pedro member by the name of David Rojas, aka Hitman, would approach Bullock and ask him about that tattoo of Kiko Loc. Rojas told Bullock that he didn't like that fool Kiko, and Bullock would respond, "Chico probably didn't like you either," and this would piss Rojas off. As Bullock began to leave the party, he saw Rancho San Pedro members waiting for him near his car. He decided to go back in and get Michael because Michael was very well acquainted with the Rancho San Pedro members. So Michael and a few others would walk Bullock outside to his car. Bullock once again would tell the San Pedro gang members that he did not gangbang and he didn't have a problem with them. Rancho San Pedro member Trejo would actually shake Bullock's hand and he would walk across the street. But the other members of Rancho San Pedro, Rojas and Garcia, didn't move and they weren't looking for a handshake. So Michael, who knew Garcia and Rojas, tried to calm the situation down as he placed his hand on Garcia's shoulder. But Garcia would knock Michael's hand off, and this would anger Michael, who took his shirt off. Moments later, Trejo would fire 2 warning shots in his ear, and then Garcia would immediately grab the gun from Trejo. As Michael Gutierrez was walking back up the stairs, Garcia would shoot him directly in the back of the head, and 3 more times as he collapsed on the steps. Not only would he shoot Michael, he would shoot 2 other people. Immediately afterwards, Garcia and the rest of the Rancho San Pedro members would flee the scene. Sadly, Michael Gutierrez would die at the scene, while other members who were shot would survive. Days later, Hector Garcia would be arrested and would be eventually convicted and be sentenced to 75 years to life for Michael Gutierrez's murder. Now, at this point, the racial tension was very high amongst the gang. On October 15, 2007, Rancho San Pedro member Oscar Gomez and other members spotted a 51-year-old black man by the name of David Franklin and a lady by the name of Sharonda walking through the San Pedro housing projects. And out of nowhere, they suddenly attacked him. Franklin would be stomped and kicked while he was on the ground as they screamed racial slurs at him. A neighbor would yell for them to stop, only for Gomez to drag 51-year-old Franklin further and continue to stomp on him. Eventually, Gomez and the other gang member would run away, leaving Franklin unconscious, laying in his own blood. Ambulance would arrive, but Franklin would die from a massive brain hemorrhage. Gomez and his brother Antonio both would be arrested and charged with murder and eventually sentenced to life in prison for the death of 51-year-old David Franklin. Now, years later, Rancho San Pedro would be hit with a massive federal indictment.
Yeah, Mike, it was a small army of federal agents and police officers moving into San Pedro, all there to remove a gang that's been entrenched in that community for a generation. Slipping in under cover of darkness, police and federal agents swarmed into well-known gang territory, armed to the teeth and prepared for anything. Operation Pirate Town was executed without a hiccup, targeting the Rancho San Pedro gang. 81 alleged members were hooked up and arrested. Immediately, a gang injunction order went into effect.
As of today, they're done. They come back, they get arrested. They're not coming back.
Police say they seized 100 guns and pounds of cocaine. Commander Gannon says this raid hits home literally.
I was born and raised in this community. I still live in this community. And this gang has perpetrated acts of violence against this community for far too long.
By the way, is this man, Francisco Flores, investigators are still looking for him. He is allegedly a gun salesperson, and that some of the federal investigators were sold weapons. They were undercover. They're still looking for this man.
I want to thank everybody for tapping into this video. Hope y'all enjoyed it, and I'll see y'all next time.